Hello, everybody, and welcome to our weekly consulting live sessions where we talk to you about a standard, one of the clauses from the standard, and tell you how we can help you implement the standard. So today we are continuing with RIOS, which is Recycling Industry Operating Standard. We have Mike, our EHS guru, online.
Hello.
And Asal is not here. She is doing a closing meeting in an audit she's doing, so she may join us a little bit later. But with that said, I'm going to take the role of Asal. I will read the standard and Mike is gonna dive right in. So let's put it up. Today we are talking about policy. Mike, the policy is clause 2 and it says, senior management shall establish and implement a written RIOS policies that is or are, so you can actually have multiple policies, are relevant to the scope of recycler's operation, considers the environmental impact of the recycler's operations and outputs, considers health and safety risks, the recycler's operations and outputs. So I'm gonna stop here a little bit so you can tell us what are these 3 points, kind of like samples of that.
Okay. So the first one is that it's relevant to the scope of the recycler's operation. So the policy should encompass all the things that the recycler is doing at their facility or facilities and potentially even outsourced processes. So that is something that should be considered when developing the policy, because that policy might extend beyond the walls of the yard or in scope, right? It might be going on site to do customers' work of some sort, you know, depending on whether this is a traditional metal recycler or e-scrap recycler that goes on site to do destruction of hard drives for a company. So that's something that is to take into consideration when developing these policies or policy. Another thing is considering the environmental impact of the recycler's operations and outputs. Outputs extends to both the next operation that you're doing as well as potentially downstream. So how does that affect your the environment around you? How is that material handled? Who is your downstream? How are they managing it? So all of those things should be considered in your policy. And, you know, if you go to the ISO standards, the 3 things that are involved in the environmental policy are prevention of pollution, adherence to legal and other requirements, and to continual improvement. So this is really looking more so at the footprint and the environmental impacts that the recycler has, and how are you setting up a policy that is focused around your environmental impacts and trying to minimize those things and consider those, as well as the health and safety risk of the recycler's operations and outputs, which could be quite severe. You know, there could be death or severe injury at stake if these health and safety risks are not properly managed. So that's this is kind of your a corner piece, you know, of your management system. The policy is very important. People kind of think of it as, oh, it's just something that I read once a year to the auditor, but it's kind of lays the foundation for your QESH management system, because everything flows from that. And to be honest, the auditor looks to see whether or not you're implementing things because the guidelines of the certifying bodies, you know, whether it's ANAB or the International Accreditation Forum, want to make sure that the management system adheres to these policies, and that because that's the essence of the management system. So this is a cornerstone of the standard here, and something that really needs to be carefully thought out and considered and communicated throughout the organization. But I'm giving stuff away. That's later.
No, this is great. And Mike, I have a question for you. I know what the
Sure.
answer is, but how often do you come into a new facility and you have to say, I have no idea what your company does based on your policy.
You mean when I'm going in to do consulting or something like that? And
Whether we're doing an internal audit or a third-party audit, or if
yeah,
we are helping individuals go from one standard or the next, or the, upgrading from 2016, so on and so forth. So how often would you say you come in, you read the current policy that they have, and you're like, so what do you do again?
yeah, I'd maybe half the time, something like that.
For me, it's almost always I come in and the current policy they have just looks like a policy they have taken it from somewhere and copied it, and it doesn't mention anything about the processes or the material, the metal type or whatever they process, and which industry or industries they're serving, right?
Yeah,
So I think really first when you are writing, for me, right, my approach, right, to I guess designing a policy, an organization or an individual or top management should really first define what is their process that they are proud of and committed to doing a quality job. And
mhm,
because at the end of the day, if you are recycling company, you're already reducing environmental impact overall. You're contributing to environmental sustainability. But let's first start with the process that you are specializing in. I think that's very important.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right, to have something that's specifically tailored to them. It's going to help the employees too to be more aware of it if it's actually something that's relevant to the business that they're doing, and not just some bunch of 3 pages of
Shelf.
jargon. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay, so the next it says that the policy should, or yeah, it doesn't say it says shall include or includes commitments to comply with all relevant OEH&S legal requirements, comply with all relevant stakeholder requirements, continually improve performance, the prevention of workplace injuries and illness, and the prevention of pollution. And the policy also has to provide a framework for establishing OEH&S, OEH&S. I am a little dyslexic, so I always switch the S and H and just make it
Yeah,
because it makes more sense to me if I want to. Anyway, and demonstrate a senior's management commitment to customer satisfaction. So, Mike, I think you already mentioned all of these things earlier.
it's, yes. These are things that are similar to the ISO standards, but RIOS goes a little bit further because um, it has all three um, elements of a management system of quality, environmental, and health and safety. So a combination of 9,001, 14,001, and 45,001. So comply with all relevant QESH or quality, environmental, health, and safety legal requirements. We all get mixed up on saying that. So this is something that is important because the quality legal requirements is something that is not often considered in ISO systems. Even in 9001, it might be very minimal. That's brought in from like, what is it, section 4.1. But there's nothing in there that says in your policy that you comply with customer and applicable requirements per the 9001 standard, but it doesn't specifically say legal requirements. So this is something that's a little bit more to take into consideration. What are those, if any, and how do you define those? And then it goes above to say all relevant stakeholder requirements. So, when you do SWOT analysis and then, you determine kind of the context of your organization or what is similar to that in section 1 of the RIOS standard here, and determine, who are the relevant interested parties, stakeholders, and what are their requirements. that is something that should be considered in your policy. So you don't see something like that in ISO. So this is going a little bit beyond continually improve performance. It just, that's even going beyond, because it just says continual improvement. This is specifically defining performance as a metric. How do you improve performance? You have to have objective evidence to show that performance is improved. So that is something that is different as well. Prevention of workplace injuries and illness, and prevention of pollution, and providing a framework for establishing QESH goals. Those are all very similar, but obviously those things are important as well, whether or not they're similar to the ISO standard or not. So those things are, you want to make sure that you have a framework set for preventing workplace injuries and illness, as well as prevention of pollution. And that all of these things, if it's done right and specific to the organization, should really set a framework, because it's based upon your organization. So you can set appropriate goals, measurable goals to continually improve the performance of the organization and show that you're adhering to these things, to reduce pollution, to make sure that workers are working in a safe environment, and you're reducing workplace injuries and accidents and incidents and all of those things. And then the final last thing to distinguish from the ISO standards is demonstrate senior management's commitment to customer satisfaction. So
how do you do that? How do you do that within your policy?
I mean, it could be something that is specifically, you could copy and paste stuff like this, but how do you make sure that that is something that is
customer satisfaction?
Yeah, but I mean, this is something that's specifically calling out that, senior management is part of the responsible party to be committed to ensuring that customer satisfaction is met through providing resources, through putting the right place in a position to where you're having customer requirements met so that customer satisfaction is achieved. So this is kind of going up to, the top leadership, and senior management is responsible ultimately for not only the management system, but for your customer satisfaction as well.
Yeah. So yeah, this is all great. And actually, these can be merged, because the commitments that are down below are already by default considering environmental impacts and health and safety risks, right? So if you're one of those people who believes in less is more,
Yeah.
you don't have to be repetitive. Now, in terms of communication, the RIOS policy shall be communicated to, understood by, and applied by workers, made available to the stakeholders, and reviewed at least annually by senior management, and updated as necessary.
So I think this does go a little bit beyond ISO here, in a couple ways. There's quite a bit in 7.2 and 7.3 about, competence and awareness of the policy, and awareness of objectives, and what happens if you deviate from the policy and how you contribute to it. But this, so that's kind of communicate that you need to communicate the policy to workers, and they understand it to a certain extent, but applied by workers, it's kind of the practical element of, so like, what is the worker doing? They need to know. So this policy needs to be specific enough to the company so that the worker can know, like, what am I doing on a day-to-day basis to prevent pollution? So by me sorting out the material properly, I'm reducing a stream of waste downstream that can cause more environmental impact if it's not sorted properly, or whatever the respective position and the respective duty is. There should be some connection that should be known for the sake of this in a world where the standard is implemented properly, so that is communicated and known by the workers so they can practically apply it to their job that they're doing. Made available to the stakeholders. So it depends on who your stakeholders are, on the way that you want to communicate this, but that could be something as simple as having it available on your website or available in your organization. Your stakeholders are not only like the owners, investors, and stuff like that, but remember your workers are also stakeholders, as well as your neighbors and any other people that have a stake in your performance, making sure that you're not preventing pollution and causing workplace injury and illness. So regulatory bodies, and there's other people that have a interest in your performance. So, and reviewed at least annually. So that is a requirement that is separate from ISO, because that ISO does not specifically call out timeframes. So this is something that needs to be reviewed at least annually by senior management. So it needs to be done by senior management and updated as necessary. So obviously this can be done and merged with the management review, which is probably the most appropriate thing, because you're going to want to make sure that senior management is definitely at management review. So that is a way that you can ensure that, and most likely than not, you're going to be doing your management review more than once a year, not more than once a year, at least once a year.
Yeah, Mike, thank you. That's great. I do want to kind of make an observation and kind of question to you. So like when I'm looking at this requirement as an auditor, right, in terms of objective evidence, I think it's relatively easy to find objective evidence and show that the policy has been communicated to the workers. It has been made available to the stakeholders, and it's been reviewed by senior management annually, right? But I want to ask you, when you're out there and you're auditing for the certification bodies, what do you do as an auditor to confirm or to verify or to collect objective evidence to make sure that the policy has been understood by and applied by workers?
I usually ask people, how does the policy apply to you? Or what do you do in your job to make sure that the policy is being done on a daily basis? Or, it depends how you word it, to make the person, whoever you're talking to, kind of get what you're trying to get at and understand. Sometimes it can be leading to get a answer that you want out of them, but generally I ask them, can you tell me how the policy applies to you specifically, or what are you doing to make sure that the policy is followed?
Great, Mike. Yes, exactly. Perfect. Thank you. And the reason I asked that question is to then turn back to those who are self-implementing RIOS to say, well, when you are doing this, it's very important that you also kind of practice these kinds of questions with your personnel. Or just to give them some bullet points and in the training mention it, because in terms of how it's applied by workers, it can, or what do they do to contribute to the policy, it can be simple as I follow my SOPs, my procedures and processes, right? So one of that's, I think, very important. And then understood by, again, it can be understood by, you can only really assess that through the interview. So that's why the interview portion that Mike is talking about is very important. And then the final note is that the multiple policies are acceptable to include all of these elements. And I think that's because a lot of companies already have multiple standards, or for example, like in California, you have to have illness and injury prevention programs. So if you're adding RIOS to your system, then you don't necessarily have to focus on safety within your RIOS policy, because you already have a safety policy on this end. So you can actually split your safety, environmental, and quality. And when you see that, Mike, what do you see that's more beneficial to organizations, or does it even matter?
That's a hard question to answer because it depends on the organization, the size, the structure. If you can have an integrated system, it does tend to make it easier for you because you can knock out a lot of the requirements at once. But if you do need to split it up for size or duties or stuff like that, I mean, I've seen both ways work well. It just depends on the organization. So yeah, those are things to consider. Is it too much for a couple people to manage, or, you know, so that's something to consider, right? In
The
setting
commitment,
structure.
child management commitment, right, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that brings us to end of the policy portion. And I think next week next week we have a break. Next week we go into footprint, and then the following week we have a break. So hopefully, I think next week we're going to have everybody on board, because that is quite important. And again,
Yeah.
Mike is the guru. We want to be here for that portion. So Mike, any final comments on policy?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for joining us and participating in our free consulting sessions. If you have any questions, email us at info@glenviewgroup.com. And for our training calendar, we're actually going to be doing a masterclass on R2 responsible recycling, which includes RIOS requirements as well, in July. And Mike is going to be leading that masterclass, so we look forward to seeing you there. Again, thank you very much, and see you next week for Footprint. Bye.
Bye.